Hey, Wade, how
Good,
you doing?
man. How's life? How's life in London?
Not bad, our new reality, but getting by.
At least in my perception, your business, and incidentally, I think you've done an amazing job
Thank you.
on your site. I love the merger of incredible storytelling and commerce. Great research driven stories. In fact, I've been using two of your stories, the one on the Roger Dubuis homage watches, which I know we're going to talk about today, and also the double signature watches. It's examples of the finest journalism that I know of today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's something we want to do for a long time, long time. And we had a pipeline maybe a year and a half ago, and we kept thinking, okay, so when are we going to move from interview formats to written article formats? There was never enough time. It was so resource intensive. And then we finally got an editor on board about a month ago, and we had the whole plan in place, and that just created enough capacity to be able to start doing some stuff, which was fun. It's a lot of fun to work on something that is not just strictly about selling a watch. It's
What I
definitely more engaging.
don't talk about is the aesthetics of a collected man, which I find to be very representative of what I think the contemporary reader or watch collector, or even someone that's interested in design, finds appealing about it. So I think that what you did two things. One was that you define a new style of shooting watches that I actually think is like, I think that you guys kind of pioneered that. It's got a little bit of the aesthetic that was defined by the Japanese in the 90s and the early 2000s, but there's a little bit more naturalism to it, and there's a bit more warmth to it as well. It kind of almost merges a little bit of a Vermeer kind of light sort of effect, sunlit effect on something that would otherwise be a little bit less exciting, or engaging. So I like that a lot. And I like the harmony with which your site is laid out. It creates this sort of mental sense of tranquility, which is very important during this period.
Very generous. It's funny. We were on a 2-hour conference call with web developers yesterday because we're working on the next iteration, and I was saying that it's funny. I look at the website, and almost on the day we relaunched the last version about a year ago, I'm frustrated because I'm so aware of the specific tiny things that irritate me on the front end and back end, but other people seem to enjoy it, and I think we got lucky. I think we got lucky with timing, and I think we got lucky with having other kind of sources, successful sources to kind of draw inspiration from, not least of which are kind of the Mr. Porter, the Rigs of this world. I think there was an appetite for that sort of presentation that could kind of translate itself into watches. And on the photography side, we're super lucky. We have a really great photographer, but we also have a huge amount of light. We bathe in natural light in the office. We're on a rooftop, and we just have light all the way around the sides and slanted at the angles. So it means that you can do, when it's really bright, you can do some really harsh contrasting photography across the dial.
Nice.
And it can be cool. It could be cool. Yeah, we're very lucky.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the watches that you sold. And I want to talk about one of the watches, or two of the watches that you have for sale. But let's talk a little bit about chronographs first, okay? And I want to talk, you kind of become the guy that if someone's looking for a Roger Dubuis homage chronograph, it's for me, it's Collected Man, right? That's the place you go to get it. And then also you kind of become the guy if you're looking for one of those very cool early Franck Muller amagnetic chronographs that have a little bit of that kind of Patek Breguet numeral dial aesthetic to it. You've also been the guy that's kind of and I think that's down to also you recognizing them and having the taste to be like, I love these and I want to take a position in them. But I think that's also because you're clearly incredibly resourceful, because I don't know where else you guys get these. And I know this because I bought mine from you, which I've got one here.
Hope it's still ticking away.
Exactly.
Nice. Very nice.
Thank you. So I want to start like just talking about maybe about vintage Pateks to begin with, because I think the design influence on both of these watches from the 1463 Tassi Tondi is so pronounced. But I guess let's go back to 1932 when the Stern brothers take over Patek. And then 2 years later, the world is still reeling amidst the Great Depression. It's also in Europe, you have all these various different political issues as we move towards closer and closer to the beginning of the Second World War. The world, in other words, is a bit fucked, right?
Yeah.
And what do these guys do? In 1934, they're like, boom, let's launch this, our first serially produced chronograph. So the reference 130. This is a great watch. This is from Ara Montanari's book on steel Pateks. And this has clearly got just this kick-ass dial, pulsation, and tachymeter.
And sector.
And it's a sector dial watch. And it's, when I always think of this, it's like when you kind of think of a vintage Patek chronograph, this is what you're going to think of. Beautiful compact design, 33 mm, got the great kind of square pushers that you see even in like the 5970. Cool watch. So this was made from, I believe, 34 to 64. And when I think about guys that would have worn a watch like this, I think about this era of kind of the Hollywood Playboys. I think of guys like Fairbanks or Clark Gable. I think Clark Gable had a Perpetual. And I think Duke Ellington had yeah, so there you go. It's Clark Gable. These guys have so much style as well. Look at that. And so, okay, the other thing that's cool is in 1934, the most popular movie in Hollywood is It Happened One Night, starring Clark Gable, right? And then I guess a couple of years later, they decide to launch. So from 1940, so they made 1,500 examples, is the figure that I've been given, from 34 to 64. Then in 1940, which is incidentally, the world is still fucked. In fact, it's properly fucked. Because you're like in the middle of the Second World War. And they decide to launch one of their most innovative watches. It's the Tassi Tondi, or the 1463, and their first water-resistant chronograph. It's made
for Swedish businessmen who want to go sailing.
That's right. Exactly.
Which is hilarious.
And check this out. I love these pushers on the watch, which is where the Italian sobriquet Tassi Tondi or round pushers comes from. Huge oversized pushers with this really cool ribbing. And actually these pushers, the only time you really see them again outside of Patek is when you see them in the Roger Dubuis homage watches. But let's just take a look at some of the dial variations of this. So here you've got the Arabic with the batons. There's full baton, which I think is really cool. And then, of course, there is the Roman with either batons or dots. And then I guess the one that we want to talk about. So, and to me, this would start this kind of design iconography for Patek chronographs that would endure until today. Some of the most amazing pièce unique watches have had these amazing Breguet numerals on them as well. I think the most famous of which would be some of Eric Clapton's watches, right?
Yeah. Fantastic.
So this is a super dope one. It's in steel. Breguet numerals, and you've got luminous hands and sort of plots as well. I mean, just amazing. Absolutely badass. And yeah, I guess anyone that loves. So the thing I love about this watch is that it's water resistant, And I think this is just around the same time or just after Patek had created that one watch for the Maharaja, the 1591, the Perpetual calendar in steel, also waterproof. And you're kind of like, why does a dude need a complicated Patek for it to be water resistant? And I always go back to the story of how Gianni Agnelli, his thing was that he used to like to hover his helicopter off the coast of the south of France, and he would jump from his helicopter either to the coast off of the Hotel du Cap and then swim on shore or to his house, and he would invite his friends to do the same. So Silas, imagine if you're sitting in the helicopter with him and he's like, okay, Silas, and now we jump into the ocean, and you're like, oh. You're like, fuck, my watch isn't water resistant.
Yeah. One of us would be fine, but probably not me.
Me too. So let's look first at the Franck Mullers, because I am a huge fan of Franck Muller, and in particular for what he achieved in the early part of his career. But this is a watch I've never seen before, and I want you, if you don't mind, please tell me a little bit about this, how it came across to you. And I think you've now sold two of them, right? One with a light colored dial and one with a black dial. Right?
Yeah, we had a silver dial, I think a brush dial, and then we had a black dial with printed numerals and dot index markers.
And if I'm not mistaken, Silas, is the movement for these watches is also the Lemania 2310?
So it's an 1874. So it's the 1874 Bush. Yeah, so Roger Dubuis used the 2310 as a base caliber, like the 5070 Patek. but Franck Muller used an 1874, which was, you know, a very, very good movement, but maybe just not quite in like exactly the same, you know, race league as the 2310. But a very, very good movement. Fantastic manual base.
Beautiful.
But yeah, I love these watches. I think, you know, the truth is we kind of got into these by accident. First of Roger Dubuis and then subsequently Franck Muller. You know, I think a client offered me a completely unique Palladium one in 34 millimeters, probably about 5 years ago. And we put that up and kind of the response was incredible. And obviously, we'll talk about Roger Dubuis separately, but Franck Muller, you know, discovering again a couple of years ago that Franck Muller made these early chronographs that had very similar kind of like DNA and characteristics to early Roger Dubuis, you know, obviously sparked a lot of interest. You know, there was a man who started, I think, 4 years earlier, or 3 or 4 years earlier than Roger Dubuis in terms of his own brand. Someone who had kind of, you know, in references the master of complications, looked after, you know, the particularly private collection, had a huge amount of experience working with some incredibly talented, famous watchmakers. You know, he then decided to start his eponymous brand. And he was inspired by, you know, the best of the best, the Tasty Tondi, the reference 130, as you referenced. You know, the design cues are all there, the case shape, the bezel, the pushers, you know, the dial, the dial configurations, etc. And then the movements, you know, even if it's not the same base movements, the 50-70 that we see in Roger Dubuis, you've still got a fantastic movement that's well finished. I think kind of ahead of its time. I think the funny thing is, obviously I wasn't around to talk about I wasn't there to see the reception to these pieces at the time, but it feels to me that these pieces have almost come of age now, where we're starting to see an appreciation for like a smaller case size, 37 and a half, you know, really clean aesthetics. And maybe at the time, it might have been seen as almost derivative. You know, someone might have ungenerously said, "Oh, look, he's just copying a classic Patek, but with you know, with a Le Mania movement." Today, I think that we're much more tolerant of inspiration from, you know, great heritage pieces of the past, and so we're almost coming to a point now where you know, it's almost living a second life. And you know, I love the aesthetics on both early Roger Dubuis and early Franck Muller. So it's definitely something that's been fun for us.
So, okay, this is the black dial watch that you had up on the side. And I love the fact that it's an anti-magnetic watch as well, which I guess makes sense with the solid case back as well. What does the number 5 on there represent? Yeah,
so from recollection, they did, I think that was a limited edition of 50. And there's an interesting distinction actually between Roger Dubuis and Franck Muller. Besides the movements, besides the fact that Roger Dubuis had, you know, Poinçon de Genève, besides the fact that Franck Muller movements were COSC certified versus Besançon certified for Roger Dubuis. Roger Dubuis did 28 of each variant of the Hommage Chronograph series, where typically Franck Muller would do 50. And so you'll see a series of, you know, 50, a limited edition of 50. And he would put almost like the kind of observatory dial kind of references, he would put the number on the dial as well as on the case back.
Amazing. And, you know, it's funny too, because I think you were saying about how these watches have come of age. When I think of watches from this era, I guess the sort of modern classic era, right? These are among some of the more beautiful watches I can think of. I mean, that's absolutely stunning, right?
Yeah, really classic.
Incredible. And so these are floating around out there then, right? There's a...
Yeah, I mean, I think where Roger Dubuis are very, very, very tricky to source. You know, I think I said to someone recently, we've never, ever bought a Roger Dubuis Hommage at auction. You know, it's just, they never come up, ever.
You know, it's funny, Bach said the same thing. He said he's never had the opportunity to auction one because I think it's like, you know, so it's very interesting.
I think my first conversation with Aurel was about Roger Dubuis homages back in the day. Yeah, he's always kind of talked about them. I've always been impressed by the man's taste.
What are the pricing for these Franck Muller chronographs? The market value of them right now?
I mean, so we sold. I think we sold between 12 and 15,000 pounds, or 12 and £14,000. The two different pieces that we had, one I think had papers or had full set, the other one didn't. Tremendously good value for money within the optic of that kind of niche. Other people who aren't familiar with independence or aren't necessarily familiar with the early days of either watchmakers, maybe like, oh, that doesn't sound, that good a value for a manual-based movement. But actually, relative to probably where they started, the price point where they started, the amount of time that's passed, the quality of the workmanship, the quality of the movement construction and architecture, and the kind of the tastefulness of the aesthetics, you are pretty much getting a piece of history that I think is only going to be more collectible going forwards, because the fundamentals are so good. Whenever I look at a brand today, especially with indies, whether it's Red Shepherd de Crivier, whether it's François Pellejourne, whether it's Roger, Philippe, Carrie, or even Dubuis, I always try and understand whether the fundamental characteristics of each has, a natural suggestion of longevity, whether there's a sort of, whether it's too niche or whether it's too, too novel to kind of be timeless, or whether as a kind of combination of things, those characteristics lend themselves to a likely long-term kind of success. And, for me, Franck Muller, it's our most recent kind of thing that we've stumbled upon almost by accident and fallen in love with. But I expect we'll probably do quite a few more, because it ticks so many of the boxes.
Absolutely. Well, it's also good to remember that when both Roger Dubuis and Franck Muller came out, their prices were pretty punchy. They
were.
They were kind of doing a bit of a Richard Mille before Richard. And they had set them at a very high part of the market as well. But to be fair, also with exquisite watches. Okay, let's transition from this, and I guess we need to tell the story of a little bit of Roger Dubuis, who had worked before Patek. And also a gentleman named Carlos Diaz as well, who I just found out is apparently following us on Instagram. So hello, Carlos Diaz, if you're watching this. And about the Audemars watches, which have become one of our favorite watches. Tell us why you initially gravitated towards these the Audemars, the Bulletin d'Observatoire watches, both the chronometers, I think, and also the chronographs, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I think we were super lucky, or I was super lucky, because as I mentioned earlier, I was initially introduced to these pieces completely by chance. And then once you kind of dive in, especially if you're in my line of business, into researching one of them, you end up finding, it's like going down a rabbit hole. I mean, the gentleman's story, where he came from, his pedigree in terms of his watchmaking past, the way he kind of limited the production numbers of each given series, the fact that he really didn't like pinch on pennies in his production. I mean, I think one of the things that most came out of our research was the idea that he went in every single instance the best version in terms of production quality of case, of dial, of movement, etc., that he could find. And I think that's what's impressive. If you find something that that has fantastically well-made cases, has fantastically well-made dials, has sapphires that were extremely expensive to produce at the time, especially on the Sympathy range. Yes. Really fantastically finished movements, fantastically made pushers like the Tassi Tondi that you referenced. Everything kind of comes together, and then you see that it's Besançon certified, which has always been like a little bit of a niche collector's kind of passion, I suppose. When a movement has a Besançon certification, it's just a little bit further along than COSC, because from recollection, I think Besançon, you have to test the watch in its integrity. You can't just test the movement. I think with COSC, you can test the movement, but you don't have to test the watch assembled. Whereas Besançon, the whole thing has to be assembled and ready to go, which adds its own complexities. And so you can see that this was watchmaking that cut no corners. And I think inevitably, when you understand that, you see that it really does line up a lot of very cool things. And inevitably, it kind of gives you a feeling that you kind of stumbled across something that hasn't yet been fully understood or fully appreciated. So that's that's how we got into it. And then obviously we've been lucky and we've had the opportunity to offer quite a few over the last couple of years.
You know, I love the fact, you know, in your story, and I guess I'm urging everyone that's watching this to go and check out the story on A Collected Man, which I think is kind of that seminal story on the Audemars chronographs. You actually break down the quantities that were made in every different sort of version of that, which I think is amazing to have. But I also like the fact that you were also showing packaging of the Roger Dubuis watch at the time versus, like, say, a Patek. And actually, in every instance, you're right. It's like Roger Dubuis has kind of gone out of his way to create like the best looking offer, the best looking package. I think this is my watch, actually. Yeah, it's Besançon certified as a chronometer, and the distinction being that it's an actual watch that's tested as opposed to a movement. In fact, I think the only time that cost has moved towards testing watches has only been very recently. And other than that, it was always just movements. And then it's also Geneva seal as well, which is, you know, one is a finishing sort of criterion, and the other is a performance criterion, and kind of, I guess, the best in each.
Yeah, very much.
The thing with the Tassi Tondi is, at the end of the day, it's an amazing watch, but it is a vintage watch, right? It's 35 mm. Yeah. It's whereas these watches, I think, you know, are still relatively modern, that you can wear them and have fun with them, right? You know, also bear in mind that several sizes made, 37 if I'm not mistaken, and also 40, correct?
34, 37, and 40. I think yours was an H40.
Are the Piguet numerals found exclusively on the H40s?
Yes, from recollection. I think it was to do with the proportions of the dial. So I think Mr. Dubuis, you know, it's funny, you only kind of piece this together almost after the fact as you like pull the information together. But yes, it seems like consistently the Breguet numerals are only on the H40s. And I think that's because he didn't want to compress too much.
And I think he does, for the two smaller sizes, he does a very nice sector dial as well, which I think kind of works better in that size. But, you know, just take a look at this as well. So this is, you know, I think it was Aura Montanari that was saying for Breguet numerals, this was his favorite modern dial. And you look at it, it's really quite remarkable. It's cool also because he's kind of defined his own language. You've got the, you know, Breguet 12, 7, 6, and 5. But traditionally in Pateks, it was all the numerals with the exception of the 3 and the 9, right? And so then he also mixed into there these kind of pointed baton markers that are beveled as well, which add a kind of additional dimension. And then he's added these applied dot indexes for the minutes as well. So it's a very, how shall I put it, expressive and somehow almost overabundance of features, but it just works super well. And it kind of brings this almost Latin concupiscent sexiness otherwise to a otherwise quite Swiss watch, you know?
Well, it's super, I think it's super difficult. I think that's something that people, especially, you know, if you haven't designed a dial, you know, I've never worked in a watch brand, but, you know, I think my impression is that it's a lot harder than people think to design a dial. If you think about all the elements you have to bring in, all the proportions, all the symmetries, all the kind of balances, the aesthetic palettes, etc., you know, it really isn't a kind of like, well, let's take these hands because I like them, and these applied indexes I like them, and we'll use a black dial as opposed to a silver dial. You know, the subtleties, for example, of the outer scale in terms of I think it's like, from recollection, I think it's like a gilt track, which is just fantastic. You know, you've got the contrast between the rose gold hands, you've got the applied Breguet numerals, you've got this gilt outer track, then you've got the depth of the black dial. It's you know, there's a lot to like with these sorts of watches, I think, but you know, it's a shame more of them weren't made.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I also think that in terms of typography, in terms of the way he created his scale, as you were saying as well, it was an absolute masterpiece. So for me, I think the version of it that I like the best is the version with the Breguet numerals and with the pushers as well. I think the mono pusher has its own following, and it's a wonderful watch. It's a really wonderful watch, actually. The reason why I dig the Breguets with the pushers is because they have these Tassi Tondi inspired pushers on them as well, right? So I think someone's going to pull up an image of that now, which is the watch that I had the pleasure of purchasing from you as well. So it's an H40 black dial Breguet numerals with the Tassi Tondi pushers.
Yeah, still to this day, I think my favorite Roger Dubuis. I've yet to have a salmon dial in my hands, which might possibly trump it. But like, until that day, of all the ones I've seen, my favorite is the one that you picked up. Along with, you know, I am equally a big fan of the mono pusher. with the same dial configuration. But I think the 2-pump chrono wins it.
Yeah, that's an awesome watch. The salmon I've seen because Mike Tay has one, and
I've not seen that one in the metal.
Yeah.
I've got to ask Mike to show me next time.
This is also interesting because it just kind of shows you the variety of dials that are available as well. So mine is actually kind of a matte dial, but this is also quite interesting because it's got this beautiful engine turning underlaying it as well. Which so it has the engine turning, but does not have the applied dots, right? So it's almost like every time he approaches a dial, he's trying to find exactly the right mixture of ingredients, and I think he kind of gets it consistently really well. Okay. So, what would you say? Like like I was asking Aurel from his perspective, does he feel that there's still room to move for these? And I think he's encouraging people that own them to hang on to them. What would you say is the market value of one of these right now?
I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, I'm not an unbiased source, given how kind of active we've been in that space. But what I can say is, every time we put one up, we're absolutely inundated. We have a long waiting list of people, so that now it's got to the point where we ask people for exact definitions of what they're looking for in order to avoid getting to a situation where things get too kind of delayed pre-listing. But everybody who has collected this sort of piece in the past has held on to it. From my knowledge, whenever I've talked to clients subsequently, they've always still got the watch. We're never able to find them. They're limited to a very specific number of each variant. So there's like a very defined quantity of what makes them rare. I don't know. I mean, the last few have been between 30 and 40,000 pounds. Inevitably, there's going to be more upside because someone put one up recently, I think, and sold it privately on one of the forums towards the kind of 40 mark. And so, if you're achieving that sort of price point privately, that typically indicates that it would go higher in a public, in a more sort of public setting for a dealer or an auction. But again, like, all the fundamentals are there. So anyone who digs independence, anyone who collects independence and appreciates, the history of kind of independent watchmaking, as well as early Patek, will find something in there that they like. So I'm optimistic. I think I always try and avoid taking a position on where prices will go, because it's just such a dangerous thing to do, but I'm optimistic. I put it that way.
The only thing I wish that someone would do is to start making a 21 lug width, like beads of rice, like white gold bracelet. That would be insane.
That'd be the best thing ever. That'd be the best. I'm such a fan of beads of rice bracelets, whether it's Gay Foresti or originals, whether it's the ones that are made in Japan now, or whether it's I think it was Auro who had his Laurent Ferrier micro rotor that was made from Philips on a beads of rice bracelet, and I saw that and I just thought, this is just incredible. You've got this perfect marriage of classically inspired aesthetics, with Breguet numerals from recollection. I think his is with Breguet numerals, inspired in a similar way by. Oh yes, his is the sector dial. But like I think we had a black enamel micro rotor with. Yeah, and we put it on a beads of rice at one point just to see it privately, and it just was incredible, But yes, you're right. Ara had the sector dial, and his was on a Gayfet bracelet, and I wish someone would bring that back. And I did lobby, I did lobby Laurent Ferrier to look into that at one point, but it wasn't to be, sadly.
Maybe one day in the future. Okay, so let's go from here to a watch that you happen to have in your inventory now that I think is a killer. So let's go back to 1972 with the launch of the 5402, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, the watch that's launched in the midst of the quartz crisis, 2 years into or 2.5 years into the launch of the Seiko Accutron. And Audemars Piguet decided they're going to do something, one of the kind of wildest and most how shall I put it? Just kind of like crazy moves possible is they created this integrated bracelet steel watch and they priced it at the same price as a Jaguar. And also it's a design that like no one had ever seen before. It's absolutely revolutionary. It is the Royal Oak. So, and I guess the mythology goes that people think of this watch as having kind of transformed the fortunes of AP. And of course, actually this watch took a little while to kind of gain traction. And then when I, from what I understand, it also kind of helped that it became adopted and co-opted by kind of the Italian Playboy scene / some members of the royal family, including Prince Michael of Kent. And it became associated with a certain lifestyle.
I mean, it's funny how a lot of these watches, these great watches that became iconic subsequently, were born in times of challenge and uncertainty for the Swiss watch industry or for the world. That's always something that I found remarkable, whether it's the quartz crisis or, whether it's, war or whether it's competition from Japan.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like the 1518 and the 1526 were both born into some of the most challenging times conceivable, So here we have the AP Royal Oak, 1972, it was born into. This is the first series, 5402. A-series watch, interesting watch that it's got a bit of a kind of patina going on the dial. I guess some of them have a tendency to go a little bit tropical, which is quite beautiful, actually. But there's another watch that is a watch also credited with saving AP's fortunes in the 70s, and that is their ultra thin perpetual calendar, the reference 5548. And this is, I think one of the kind of cool modern classics. Is a little bit overlooked at the moment, right? Like if you look at the prices of like Royal Oak perpetual calendars, even the first series of them, the first generation 55, 54s, the prices on those things have gone kind of nuts in just the last couple of years. Like I was looking at one, I think like 5 years ago, and I think they've actually doubled, if not gone even further than that in just 4 years. But the 5548 still seems to be a pretty decent value to me. I mean, actually a really good value. I've seen yellow gold ones in the kind of 10 to 15,000 pound range. And I know you have a platinum, which is a super rare version as well. Tell us a little bit about that watch.
Yeah, I mean, the watch was conceived basically in secret. From my understanding of the story, I was with an archivist at AP one day, talking about a completely different watch, and he kind of just sort of suddenly interrupted me to say, "Oh, I saw that you've had a couple of these. Do you know how it happened?" And so my understanding is that the movement and the concept of the watch itself was basically worked on secretly by a handful of watchmakers who were fearful of the idea being rejected by the head of kind of product approval at AP. Because it was a time of, uncertainty and nervousness, and they couldn't afford to sort of put a foot wrong. And so they did it themselves in their own time. They kept it secret until it was ready to present. And they gave, they presented a prototype. And the head of product approval, whose name sadly I can't remember off the top of my head, was just blown away and said, "This is amazing." And at the time, it can't be understated how impressive this like the thinness of this movement was. The thinnest automatic perpetual movement on the market. And then it had this kind of really cool stepped bezel, which I think was introduced by a lady, I think her name was Jacqueline Dimier, when she joined AP. I read about that somewhere.
Protege of Gerald Genta.
Yeah, exactly. And so she introduced this step bezel, and suddenly you have this watch that has, certainly lugs that kind of, are reminiscent to an extent of the Disco Volante inspiration of the 3448, in the sense that they're kind of quite slim and downwards curving. And then you have, an incredibly balanced paired back design aesthetic on the dial. Really nice proportions. You have, a thinness on the wrist that just means that it's very discreet, pops under the cuff. And actually something that understandably confuses a lot of people is it's a perpetual calendar, but there isn't a perpetual calendar display. There isn't a leap year indicator on the dial. And I think that kind of speaks to the kind of the innovation at the time that, yes, the movement was a perpetual calendar movement, but in order to achieve that kind of thinness, in order to maintain the integrity of the original design, which was, to have a very slim automatic movement, the perpetual function has to be set by the watchmaker. But if you're wearing this, every day, because it's a watch that could be worn every day. Yes, it's in a precious metal, but it's understated. You know, it's in a comfortable case size at the time. You know, which is just incredible. This was considered oversized. You know, it's like 37.2, 37.3 millimeters. You know, and at the time, people thought this was a big size case. You know, today this is on the slimmer side, although we're definitely seeing a return to kind of smaller case shape preferences. But yeah, I mean, it was truly groundbreaking. You know, really groundbreaking.
I always find it kind of funny that AP is the brand that kind of introduced the wristwatch with the leap year indicator, and then when they decide to launch, you know, the 5548, they decide to do away with it. I guess, you know, in the context of the 70s and the 80s, it was like, yeah, I think we've got enough information.
Yeah, I think so. It's it's quite ironic.
So let's go to the last watch, or no, actually, you know what? Let's go to the Roger Dubuis Sympathy Perpetual Calendar, double retrograde Perpetual Calendar chronograph that you happen to have, because that's such a cool watch. And since we're on the subject of perpetual calendars, so this is, first of all, a movement that's kind of a legendary movement, right? Because this is a movement that is created in a collaboration between Jean-Marc Wiederich and Roger Dubuis.
Yeah.
And it's the first perpetual calendar with a double retrograde display. I think it appears also on a Harry Winston watches around this time, or if not earlier, I think. But this is such, so tell us a little bit about the Sympathy, because it's such an unusual K-shape. And then tell us about this specific watch, which I guess is the ultimate version of it, because it's on the chrono. It's on the Lemani 2310 base.
Yeah. So as you said, it's the same base movements as the Audemars, the 2310. It has this module that was developed in partnership with Jean-Marc Wiederich of Agenor now. It has this faceted crystal in this very unusual kind of faceted shaped case. You know, to be able to cut sapphire at that angle in those days was really no small achievement at all. And I think, you know, today we think of Richard Mille and we think of all this innovation. But, you know, in 1997, I think it was 1997, that watch, you know, you really were talking about something that was hard to do, hard to achieve. And you know, and many of these watches have their original sapphires, because, you know, I'm not sure. I've never asked, I've never tried. I don't know to what extent the brand today, you know, is able to replicate those original sapphires. And so, you know, you've got, you know, really unusual case design. You have really unusual dial symmetry and aesthetics, but it works. You know, it works in white and in a black dial. These are, you know, some of my favorites. You know, perpetual configurations. There's a lot of information, but the way in which, you know, the days and the days of the week and the dates kind of get bigger, then smaller as they get to the center, and then expand again. You know, the kind of the outer track, the layout of the hands. It's a lot of information, but it's not intimidating. It's not too busy. And it's all
so cool about this watch, and I never realized it until I looked at it. It like blown up to this size. It's actually using the 48-month format perpetual calendar leap year display for the months that was from the 1516 from AP as well, that we were just kind of talking about. And it's kind of cool because, you know, whoever designed this dial, I guess it's Roger, he has so much love for all these different, you know, periods in watchmaking, because I guess the 1516 is more from, like, I guess the 40s or the 50s, and then you've got, no, I'm sorry, it's from the 50s to the 60s, and then you've got these at the same time, these wild expression of like the day and the date that you know I've never seen before in watchmaking. It's so adventurous, and all at the same time such a sort of nice homage to classical watchmaking.
But I think that's kind of what sort of almost caught people off guard. You have someone who, you know, in the name of the series of his first chronographs, you know, paid tribute to classical Genevan watchmaking, and yet could then take a step from what was incredibly, incredibly historically inspired but extremely tasteful aesthetics to a completely different design language. You know, yes, there are the different signature elements of Roger Dubuis in there, but it's a completely novel case shape. It's a completely novel idea to kind of have this faceted sapphire, the kind of the retrograde dates, the balance on the dial. It's both very Roger Dubuis and not at all Roger Dubuis as you kind of, you know, knew it if you only knew the Audemars chronograph line. very, very innovative.
It's funny too, because
Very
I'm mentioning also Journe and Franck Muller, and I'm a big fan of Journe, and I think Journe is a perfect expression of what you were saying about the aesthetics that kind of endure. Like, I mean, his designs haven't really changed that significantly from when he first started. In fact, his early stuff has become super collectible, right? So,
yeah.
But it endures. But these two guys were like real, like kind of rock and rollers back in the early days of independent watchmaking. You know,
pioneers. They were, you know. It's I'm not going to say it was the golden age of independent watchmaking, because I think that would be a disservice to so many of the amazing work that a lot of, you know, very successful independent watchmakers are doing today, and you were getting all sorts of original ideas every day. But there was something about those early days where everyone was trying to find their feet and figure out what it meant to be an independent watchmaker, whether it was using base calibers. You know, look at Carey with the early observatoires. You know, he used, or with all the observatoires, he used the Piguet 60 base movement, which was, you know, an observatory chronometer certified movement that never went into, you know, wristwatch production. You know, and he took that, and, you know, for me, in many ways, despite, you know, loving the Venturiques and loving the retrograde date, and you know, hugely appreciating all the watches he came up with later, there's something about that kind of that early Carey where he kind of leans on a great historical movement whilst pairing it with his own particular identity that really speaks to me, particularly the very, very first ones. And I kind of feel that there's something reminiscent of that in early Roger Dubuis and early Franck Muller. There's a stepping stone. There's like, before I define my own unique identity, I'm going to kind of, you know, pay homage and take inspiration from the things that existed before that I admire, try and pair the best aspects of each of them, and then I'm going to kind of bring my own signature to it. And I think that's what defined that stage, that early time of independent watchmaking, which I love so much.
I absolutely agree. It's so cool. Okay, here we go. Here's the Harry Winston. Yeah. Like, also like quite a cool watch, right?
Very cool. Very cool. Very cool. Have you seen the Harry Winston Resonance? I was looking at that the other day.
Yeah, I have. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to see one of those in the Meta one day. That just kind of, you know, that blows my mind. I was watching Jean's lecture to the Horological Society of New York, I think from last year, where he kind of explains, along with Osama and Pierre Halimi, the kind of, you know, the story of the first resonances. And I was just, I was blown away, absolutely blown away. It's cool, you know, it's super cool. You know, you can really, again, see, you know, I think Jean is probably an example of where there's been a degree of consistency that's more striking possibly than with others. You know, as you said, his design language and his design cues are very kind of on point. You know, I'm wearing a tourbillon today that in many ways hasn't changed that much since, you know, in 20 years. You know, the original design of the Jean tourbillon is very, very classic and consistent. But yeah, I'm curious to see whether the Harry Winston pieces, particularly the early Harry Winston pieces, kind of develop their own collecting momentum, because really, you know, they really are, you know, important pieces of history. And if you want to get to the kind of the, you know, if you want to find something rare that has early DNA, those are pretty choice examples.
I'm inclined to believe they're probably slightly undervalued relative to what they represent. And, you know, 100%. Like, was so much a huge part of that independent watchmaking, sort of like the proliferation of that message. It's funny too, because when I had a chat with him, he told me that his HM3, he had initially designed it to put a Journe resonance movement in there, which, you know, when you look at it now, you would never imagine it. Then apparently to Journe, and Journe was like, no.
that sounds like Mr. Journe.
But hold up your watch so we can see your tourbillon.
It's so it's just it's an early. I'm not sure if you can see it in the camera. It's just it's an 2001 rose gold dial brass movement piece. But it's, you know, I think I look at it and, you know, I really do see so much kind of consistency of language. You know, you go all the way back to 2000, 2001, and then you fast forward to today. Jean has been radically consistent in the kind of the base kind of fundamentals of his design. And you know, it's just him. He's so he's so fantastically stubborn in a good way, and so incredibly, like, regimented in not wanting to just kind of, yes, you'll find a stone dial, or yes, you'll find, a couple of unique eccentricities which make certain watches special. But broadly speaking, the fact that he's been so disciplined has made for, like an incredibly cool and clean lineage throughout the years. So much so that you can track the tiny nuances, which I think, the more I think about it, explains why early Jean kind of has, increasingly kind of almost vintage-esque appeal, considering
Absolutely.
the time frame is so short.
The one of the best stories I was ever told, and I cannot state emphatically whether they're true or not. But the legend kind of goes that there is a guy who was, fairly big, well-known member of the Geneva watch scene, and, kind of dealt in antiquities. And he one day managed to purchase the ledger of a watch brand that had registered all of the watches that were made and what complications and so on. And that two of the great independent watchmakers, which we had discussed on Muller throughout this conversation, they then took it upon themselves to go back and actually make all of those watches and recreate them essentially by hand, right?
Yeah.
And then offer them this for sale, or brokered them through this sort of this individual, which to me is really interesting, because from one end, yes, it's probably illegal what they did, but on the other hand, it's probably the historic collaboration of two of the greatest watchmakers of all time. And if you could get your hands on one of these forgeries, these watches are probably more valuable than the actual watches, because they're the hands of these two masters have actually touched them. So
yeah. I've heard stories. I've certainly heard of one particular watch that I know to exist that has been very kind of tastefully and harmoniously adapted and added to by one famous name, and I know that the person who owns the watch, is incredibly happy, because for them it's kind of like an homage, is perhaps an overused word at this point, but it's certainly a tasteful kind of, clin d'oeil or flick of the hat to something that means a lot to them.
Absolutely. So let's go from here to, I guess, one of the most mythical wristwatches of all time, a watch that you sold. A watch, a George Daniels wristwatch, one of the only 4 custom-made wristwatches that he ever made. This one is nicknamed Blue for its incredible blue indexes, and it was a watch that also is part of Roger Smith's story as well. So let's talk about Roger and George Daniels, and just tell us what you find appealing about these guys.
Sure. I mean, George was undeniably, one of the greatest, if not, one of the greatest, if not the greatest sort of watchmakers of the last 250 years. Who else was making watches completely by hand on his own in isolation in London and later in the Isle of Man with, such incredible complications, the Space Traveler and the Grand Comp, etc., in the form of pocket watches. So in George's story, a man I sadly never had the pleasure of meeting, you have, this incredible journey of almost hermit-like isolation. You have a man who has decided to make his life's work, his pursuit, to be, the kind of attainment of, the highest form of what he considers to be, the craft of watchmaking. And so he's gone, and he doesn't care about, commercialization. He needs to sell watches, but that was never a challenge. He chose his clients. He was, from the stories I've heard, an incredibly principled and, equally stubborn man at times, in the sense that he wasn't going to be influenced by what anyone else was doing. He wasn't going to be pushed to do something that he didn't want to do. He was going to follow his journey and be true to his vision of independent watchmaking to the last, which is exactly what he did. And, Roger's story with George is extraordinary, because, George didn't want any apprentices. George had kind of got further away from the world by moving to the Isle of Man. And there was this young, this young gentleman from trying to think, where was Roger brought up? Not Birmingham, but in that kind of neck of the woods. He'll probably kick me for that. Who had started off in watch servicing and repair. His father had given him a clock that he completely dismantled and put back together. He'd had George's early book on watchmaking, which he'd sort of self-taught to try and make a watch himself. He'd written to George. George had invited him to the Isle of Man. He'd shown him his watch. And George had very politely told him to go away and come back. And I think it was 5 years later or 4 years later, Roger returns with this second attempt. And George quietly inspects the watch and doesn't give anything away. Roger's, sitting there nervously thinking this is the culmination of almost half a decade of labor in this kind of make or break moments. And George just kind of quietly turns to him and says, "Congratulations, a watchmaker." And, there was this kind of extraordinary moment of kind of connection between two men who, would had very different, but in some cases quite similar personalities, both extremely hardworking, both incredibly determined, both, real kind of passionate watchmakers who were doing it for reasons that had nothing to do with money whatsoever. They were doing it because it's what they wanted to do. Connected, and George offered Roger the opportunity to become an apprentice. Roger moved to the Isle of Man in his old, I think it was a Ford Escort, he told me, moved everything to the Isle of Man, which, it is challenging today, but can you imagine, 20 years ago, this kind of windswept, slightly barren island in the Irish Sea, that was connected by, I'm not even sure there were regular flights at the time, but you had to take the ferry, there probably were. And he moved and he took this leap of faith, and then he worked with George every day, at the bench, and George imparted knowledge to him. And, George, I think, didn't want an apprentice, but in Roger, he found a kind of a kinship, and he found someone who genuinely appreciated what he did and, was motivated by the right things. And so George did what he could to take him under his wing. And so they worked more and more together, and Roger was, incredibly talented, which I think is kind of, I think in some ways the story is all about how Roger took a chance. In other ways, it's about George taking a chance on Roger. And in some senses, it's just because of sheer talent. Maybe one way or the other, we'd know about Roger Smith today, independent of George, but everything came together. And you had this apprentice who, worked hand in glove with a great man, stayed close to him until, he finally passed away, learnt as much as he possibly could from him. And now we have, someone who I think carries that legacy forward, George's legacy forward, to the best traditions possible, in the best traditions possible.
And this is a very interesting watch, Blue, that you brokered, and I think you actually sold for £1 million, if I'm not mistaken. And based on I think it was in 2005. I think the purchase price was £40,000. It's quite a remarkable achievement. However, it's also, it's one of 4 existing custom-made wristwatches that George Daniels had ever created. I think the assembly was actually done by Roger Smith. It is a 1-minute tourbillon. With the coaxial escapement, so the escapement that George Daniels designed as well, and a calendar function as well. But to me, it's something just mythical. It's breathtaking. For you, why is it that you think this price was achieved? And and what was that entire process like? Did someone reach out to you, and what did you think when you received that call?
So I'll tell you the full story. Roger had been approached about this watch by the owner, and he invited me to dinner. Every time Roger's in London, we generally catch up for a drink or dinner. And he was, I think, delivering a watch that had just been serviced, and sort of he'd just passed that watch to me, and we'd had dessert, and we were on a kind of after dinner drink. And then he just kind of casually pushed this other watch to me, and he asked me what I thought of it. It's like, wrapped in a napkin for the purposes of discretion. And I had this double take, and I wasn't sure if I drank too much or if I was seeing something that wasn't there. But I was kind of completely speechless because, as you said, only 4 Daniels signed wristwatches were ever made. 2 that George made entirely himself, 2 that he designed and was commissioned to make, and Roger helped assemble. and make, to give full credit to the man. But they did it, together, because, this watch represented, I think, a turning point in George's relationship with Roger, because Roger had completed a large amount of work. I think the Millennium series was completed, and he wasn't sure that economically it was viable for him to continue, being on the Isle of Man and making watches, without greater alternative sources of income. And so George said to him, look, this is a difficult time. It's harder for me to see. The dexterity of my fingers is not, what it once was. I'm sure he didn't put it in those words, but, I'm kind of imagining that that's sort of how the conversation went. And say one more time.
He was in his 80s by this point, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So George had this fantastic career, and he said, look, I've got this commission. I've designed this watch. Will you help me make it? And so they did it. They did the blue and they did the white, two kind of sister watches, one with the blue index markers that we sold, and another with the white index markers that is it's still in private hands. The pricing, it was interesting, because in many ways the price could have been much more. But it was, there's something about, I think it's very important, especially in a market with very few data points, where you can't. It's even when you have very little to go off, you never want to pluck a number out of thin air. You never want to just kind of say, okay, well, this is a nice round number, even if £1 million is, or this is, this would net me X amount return extra, or whatever it may be. It's very important to have some basis in logic. And I think with the blue, I discussed it with Roger. I had a conversation with one or two individuals who were particularly kind of, familiar with these early pieces. And I kind of, we discussed it internally, and £1 million felt right. And, I think we could have asked for more, but I think that at the time it was, the most expensive watch that Roger had ever been involved in to have sold publicly, and one of the most expensive independent watches to have sold. And, it went to a fantastic home. And I'll always look back at that experience with tremendous fondness. It was a really cool time.
That's amazing. And for you, is there anyone who you would imagine to be the kind of a living equivalent of George Daniels today? I know you've been quite successful at selling some Dufours as well,
Yeah, I think the closest to George's legacy is Roger. But I think in terms of in the pantheon of independent watchmakers, you have Philippe, of course, as well, Monsieur Dufour. You have François Paul, and yes, a bigger brand producing a large number of watches, kind of straddling that gap. But you look at his early pieces, and it's the same. Everything, all the sort of the same vibe is there, all the same feel is there as the kind of the great independence. And in some ways, the finishing is not completely dissimilar to George. If you look at one of George's, pocket watch movements, the finishing was not the priority. The priority was the watch and the complication and the achievement.
Sure.
But obviously, you look at Recep, someone that I've been very fortunate to be able to work with for 3 or 4 years, and we have a similar age, and I think that if I was a betting man, not that I gamble. I think if I was a betting man, I'd probably, say that here, there's someone who kind of gives me, of the kind of new generation of watchmakers, the greatest cause for optimism. I think Recep, apart from being just a phenomenally talented guy, has taken inspiration from the best of the best. And I think that he is probably the person who today, in his kind of generation of watchmakers coming through, who has the most potential. Not to suggest that others don't.
Oh, I agree, and I also like the sort of symmetry in that. So I think one of our mutual friends, Michael Tay, has very good taste in watches, and it was his dad who bankrolled Philippe Dufour for the Grand Sonnery project.
Yeah, I remember hearing.
And then it's kind of cool that Michael has in some ways been part of the birth of Recep, where the transition of stage one was a Piguet, and stage 2 is Recep, which is a kind of a full vision of what he's really capable of achieving. It's very nice to see as well. Silas, I got to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Stay safe, brother, and thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Same to you, Wayne. Really enjoyed it. All the best.
Cheers.
Take care.
And
Bye-bye.
keep doing that great work.
Trying my best. Hope to see you soon.